Okay. Well, I hope you guys had good conversation as well that carried on from the Q&A, the last paper. And so we've managed to get your mind reoriented to be able to think through another paper in terms of philosophy and early modern philosophy. So it's a real privilege for me to be able to introduce our next speaker, Michael Plato, who teaches here at CCU. Michael and I are not just colleagues, but we have been friends for a good dozen years or so. We're both Canadians from Toronto. He came here to CCU a year before I did, and that was very helpful to me in terms of getting me here and then helping just my family and I orient to Colorado life. So Mike is, as I said, a Canadian, trained at the University of Toronto philosophy at Trinity College, which if you know anything about that school, that's kind of like a Cambridge-y sort of feel in Canada. And then he went on and did culture studies at Brock, then did theology at Toronto Baptist Seminary, and Mike is now in the midst of completing a PhD at the Free University of Amsterdam, where he is looking at old Princeton, the old Princetonians, particularly Archibald Alexander, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, and the relationship the Princetonians had to Scottish common sense realism, so the Scottish philosophy of Thomas Reid, which is what we're going to be hearing about now over this next little while. He's going to be presenting some of his research for us. Towards giving a paper next week, the same one at Princeton. So very appropriate to be doing Scottish philosophy at Princeton next week. He'll be presenting these things. So please welcome Professor Michael Plato.
Thank you, Ian, especially for that warm introduction. Though, of course, nothing special there because, of course, all of us Canadians know each other anyway. It's one of those things. Yeah, that's right. Do you know Dave? He's from Canada. I get that a lot. Yeah, I know Dave. Yeah, he's in Vancouver. Yeah, of course. We kind of get that all the time. So, yeah, it's perfectly natural that, we all kind of get to connect with each other. Another Canadian we've gotten to connect with down here. We all sort of, Caleb, of course, maybe, I don't know if he wants that revealed or not about himself, but we sort of all form our little expat community here. All right, well, my paper is, there's going to be a philosophical element to it, but it's going to be much more historical in nature. And it's also going to be much more preliminary. If I can just be perfectly honest with you, I've been sort of leading down one track in sort of the way I've been approaching things. And then the last week, I sort of gotten a bit of a revelation, as it were, or a new approach that I want to take. And so I'm kind of leaving this paper less developed at the end and more open, so hopefully we can have a little bit of discussion. And when I come to that point, I'll explain what I'm talking about here. Just to fill you in, Ian mentioned that I'm going to be my top paper, which hopefully everybody's got a copy of. That'll hopefully keep you following along. I'm going to be talking about what's called Old Princeton. Old Princeton is referring to Princeton Theological Seminary between the years 1812, when it was founded, and 1929, when the seminary was reorganized. And it's kind of defined in that period. They call it Old Princeton because of a particular theological and philosophical approach the seminary had, which made it very distinct. It was generally regarded in the 19th century as the bastion of conservative Calvinistic orthodoxy. It was in many ways the bulwark against a lot of the new ideas coming out of Europe, especially Germany, that were developing in theology. And so it kind of had this reputation for being this very distinct, formidable, and I would say very admirable institution. Which disappeared and certainly changed in the 20th century. And since that point, a lot of people have been trying to reassess, especially a lot of evangelicals have tried to reassess the legacy of Princeton Seminary. What can we draw from it, or what can't we? There's been a lot of scholarship, as I'm going to point out here at the beginning, especially in the early 20th century, which saw that what Princeton was doing was largely unhelpful for Christian faith, and so it was dismissed. However, More recently, there have been a number of scholars who are coming onto the scene who are trying to, shall we say, retrieve old Princeton, reassess it, and give it some place in the church. So I'm just giving you a bit of the background for everybody to understand what's going on here with what I'm talking about in this paper. And I'm going to be focusing my talk on largely the first professor. There are many people say 4 great giants of Princeton Theological Seminary: Archibald Alexander, Charles Hodge, B.B. Warfield, and J. Gresham Machen. You may be familiar more with the last names, especially Warfield and Machen. Their books are regularly published today. Hodge is still famous for his systematic theology. The least known of these is Alexander. He is the granddaddy of them all. He's the guy that set the whole thing going. And he's also the least studied and understood, and which is one of the things that sort of attracted me to him. He's just not been as much looked at. So that's really what sort of, again, the background that we're going through. I'll read through, I might make excursus or whatever as we go along. So wading into a long-term controversy, and this is what I'm going to be talking about, is often a thankless task, but a necessary one. The relationship between Princeton Theological Seminary in the 19th century and the Scottish philosophy of the previous century has been a vexing one, resulting in strongly held and opposing positions. Beginning in the mid-20th century, several historians of American theology and religion noted that while the professors of Old Princeton fancied themselves the last defenders of a truly reformed orthodoxy, they had in fact unwittingly capitulated to heterodox philosophies in their underlying theological assumptions, presuppositions, and methodologies. Specifically, their adoption of what has been called Scottish common sense realism. In the text hereafter, I call it SCSR. I will interchangeably, sometimes it's called Scottish common sense realism, Scottish realism, the Scottish philosophy. All of those terms are used interchangeably, but it's all meaning the same thing of what I'm going to be talking about. They said that the adoption of that made for an overly rationalistically and exclusively objective approach to doing theology. One of the first to air complaints stated, "This attempt to adapt theology to the methodology of Newtonian science produced a wooden, mechanical discipline as well as a rigorously logical one. The witness of the Spirit, though not overlooked, cannot be said to play any important role in Princeton thought. It is with the external, not the internal, the objective, not the subjective, that they deal." Another writer, very much in the same vein, argued that the foundational direction of Reformed theology had been inadvertently altered at Princeton. As this Scottish philosophy was adopted, the fervent theocentricity of Calvin, which Jonathan Edwards had striven to reinstate, was sacrificed, and a new principle of doctrinal interpretation was increasingly emphasized. Man's need, rather than God's word, became the guide in doctrinal formulation. Battling as they were the deistic movement and the rationalistic approach to faith, which had been gaining ground since the Enlightenment, the Princeton theologians, nonetheless, were said to have adopted a neo-rationalism which rendered the central Christian paradox into stark logical contradictions that had to be either disguised or explained away. Reformed theology was thus emptied of its most dynamic element. Consequently, this adoption of Enlightenment principles and approaches, though taken on with the best of intentions, had not helped their theology, but hindered it, producing not a vital and living faith, but instead, as one writer put it, a rather bald rationalism. Robbed of its dynamism, so the explanation went, Princeton theology faced its inevitable demise at the end of the 19th century, and this was followed by the rise of more experientially satisfying theology and religious movements to replace it, certainly such things as Barthianism, for example. Some scholars were not as harsh in their assessment of Princeton's turn to the Scottish philosophy, yet they nevertheless characterized Old Princeton theology as compromised. Mark Knoll, one of the leading historians of American religion and a major authority on Princeton's history and thought, is more nuanced and notes that Princetonians found that intuition or common sense provided certain unquestionable starting points from which good arguments could rise to rebut skepticism, defend the existence of God, and support the truthfulness of Scripture. Yet there was an irony to all of this. While they maintained an enthusiastic theoretical support for the promise of Scottish philosophy, they ended up repudiating it in practice. Princeton's principal figures, as Noel saw it, remained Calvinists, and they continued to speak of the irreducible need for special revelation, but the configuration of their thought was thoroughly of a piece with the Enlightenment. In other words, an irreconcilable split had emerged between religious thought, reason, and religious experience, piety, in the Princeton theology. Lefferts Lesher traces the origins of this theological rupture back to Princeton Seminary's first professor, Archibald Alexander. According to Lesher, Alexander's dualism of mind and heart tended to separate both theology and ethics from religious experience and to make it very difficult, if not impossible, for him to give full theological expression to the experience that was so central to his own Christian life. This dichotomy affected his heirs in the old Princeton theology even more seriously. So what you're seeing is a split between theology and religious experience happening in the thinking, that somehow its heart and head are being riven asunder. For Noel, Letcher, and several other scholars, the Princetonians may not have become fully rationalistic in the way of the deists had, but they were nevertheless operating within an untenable division between a scientifically based theological methodology and a warm, reformed, experientially lived faith, with no hope of reconciliation between the two. For the second half of the 20th century and the opening of the first of this century, this understanding of Old Princeton remained largely the shall we say, reigning orthodoxy. That began to change, however, as a new generation of scholars began to re-examine the literature of Old Princeton's leading exponents, especially that of Archibald Alexander, Charles Hodge, Benjamin B. Warfield, and J. Gresham Machen, whom I mentioned earlier. Scholars, such as Paul Helseth, challenged what he saw as this consensus view, proposing that instead of capitulating to Scottish common sense or even holding to divided loyalties, the Princetonians were in fact robustly reformed in their theological method as well as their piety. Helseth, in his seminal book, Right Reason in the Princeton Mind, argues that the Princetonians, in fact, conceived of reason in a fashion consistent with the assumptions of the Reformed tradition, even if they were not always perfectly consistent in how they put this conception into practice. He concludes that though certain aspects of their writing lend plausibility to the charge of accommodation, nevertheless, in the main, the Princetonian theologians remained more or less consistently reformed as they labored to combat the rising tide of religious subjectivism in their day. Since Helseth, a number of articles and monographs have appeared in the past few years making the same or similar assessments. That whatever its faults, Old Princeton was largely consistently reformed in terms of its theological presuppositions and methodologies. Much of this new understanding has been the result of an in-depth reevaluation of the theology of the Princetonians through a more comprehensive examination of their writings. While there has been considerable merit to this new assessment, it certainly seems to be supported by investigation. It still leaves unaccounted the clear presence of Scottish common sense realism in much of Old Princeton theology. Indeed, it seems in some instances that there has even been an effort to minimize or downplay the presence of Scottish common sense altogether. One author, for example, citing an early 20th century source, argues that although the common sense philosophy was taught at Princeton College, it was never a significant factor in the theological endeavors of the seminary. That its association with a dry rationalism makes such an effort to diminish or even dismiss Scottish common sense in Princeton theology somewhat understandable, it is unhelpful as it also negates the possibility that Scottish common sense's influence is more complex and also less understood than it had once been thought. In the following paper, I'd like to begin by providing a brief survey of Scottish common sense in antebellum America, that is America in the 19th century prior to the Civil War. especially as it was taught at the colleges and seminaries. I will then provide a brief examination of the life and teaching of Archibald Alexander and his relationship to Scottish common sense. Alexander makes an ideal candidate for this type of examination for a number of reasons, of which I shall give just two at the moment. First, he was Princeton's seminary's first professor, and many within Old Princeton and afterwards regarded him as the one who set the trajectory for the theological movement as a whole. And second, he has been held up by both sides in the scholarship debate as being exemplary of their particular position. Knoll and Letcher both argue that he sets the course towards dry rationalism in theology. Helseth argues that he was an exemplary advocate of vital Reformed orthodoxy. And then I got in my footnote some additional reasons of Alexander's importance. Finally, I would like to point toward a new paradigm for understanding Alexander and Old Princeton, one suggested by David Van Drunen. I shall assert that Archibald Alexander was neither a capitulator to Enlightenment secular rationalism, nor was he a theological recalcitrant, shunning new and innovative philosophies. Rather, he was engaging in the long-established practice within the Reformed theological tradition of engaging in natural theology. I believe this will be borne out by his utilization of Scottish common sense philosophy. So I'll give some preliminary on that, but that's where a lot of my investigation over the next while will be going. So, Scottish common sense's reception in antebellum America. The primary means by which Scottish common sense entered American life during the Revolutionary and post-Revolutionary period was through the liberal arts colleges and a newly emerging national institution, the denominational seminary. The planting of this seed for a long time had been ascribed to the Scottish preacher and Declaration of Independence signer, John Witherspoon, who became president of the College of New Jersey, hereafter Princeton or Princeton College or Princeton University, in 1768. As David Hoveler remarked, Princeton under Witherspoon thereby became the first American center of the Scottish realism of Reid and Stewart. And it is Witherspoon's instruction which begins the long ascendancy of Scottish philosophy in the American academic curriculum. Sidney Alstrom even calls Witherspoon's Scottish common sense's first real ambassador. Scholars since Hoveler have noticed the inaccuracy of this claim, however. Gordon Graham, for example, points out that David Fordyce's, a very important figure in Scottish common sense, The Elements of Moral Philosophy, was already a standard textbook at Harvard before Witherspoon even arrived in the colonies. More importantly, it appears Witherspoon was not even acquainted with the writings of Thomas Reid, and I should have put the date, for reasons I missed his dates. His dates, for the historians, are 1710 to 1796. Witherspoon was not even acquainted with with Thomas Reid, who is generally regarded as the key figure of Scottish common sense, nor any of Reid's successors. The only major Scottish philosopher Witherspoon shows any real familiarity with was Francis Hutchinson. In fact, it was Samuel Stanhope Smith, Witherspoon's native-born son-in-law and his successor as Princeton's president, who was the first Princetonian to show the influence of Reid's philosophy, and was the first major proponent of Scottish common sense in America. Charles Bradford Bow, building on the thesis of Graham, argues in his dissertation and subsequent publications that it was Smith, in a radical shift from Witherspoon, who created what he calls the Princeton Enlightenment and made it the center for the dissemination of Scottish common sense realism. Key to its dissemination in America were his lectures on moral and political philosophy, first published in 1812. It was only after this point that, as later Princetonian James McCosh notes, Scottish became the most influential philosophy in America. The next generation of college presidents following Smith's lead were largely responsible for Scottish common sense's rapid dissemination, not only through teaching, but also their own publications. Among them, the most prominent of these president-teacher writers, and this is kind of an interesting thing of American history, that presidents were always professors at the schools, usually ministers, and also publishers of their own works. The most prominent were Francis Wayland at Brown University, Francis Bowen at Harvard, and Noah Porter at Yale. While the new philosophy became somewhat surprisingly dominant among theological conservatives, and more specifically, that social and cultural hegemon of the antebellum period, the Reformed or Calvinist Orthodox, Scottish common sense appealed to a diversity of schools. As Richard J. Peterson notes, between 1768 and 1850, almost every important school of thought in America integrated major elements of common sense into its philosophy, including many of the more purely American forms of thought developed prior to 1850. For example, Scottish common sense played a role in developing Unitarian and liberal theology at Harvard. It also was involved in making Calvinism more palatable for the New Divinity and New Haven theologians at Yale, and also for fortifying the orthodoxy, especially of Calvinism, in the American South. Even the Transcendentalists of Boston found Scottish common sense of use by helping them develop their understanding of intuition. So what was it about Scottish common sense that made it so appealing? All across the board in America, it seems. For those within conservative seminaries, and I'll just stick to them primarily, and divinity schools, one of the most useful facets of Scottish common sense was his ability to provide a bulwark against the intellectual and religious dangers emanating from Europe. Of these, the primary culprit had been the Humean skepticism, which had emerged from the same national birthplace as common sense. Indeed, Scottish common sense had been early shaped by Thomas Reid, especially in his inquiry into the human mind, to counter the challenges of David Hume. Reid, at one point, is often said to have had the same awakening from dogmatic slumber that Kant did from reading Hume. Both of them, Reid and Kant, reacted to Hume in this, for the same reasons, but went in very different directions. Along with skepticism, Scottish common sense was used to address deism and atheism, and later in the 19th century, it would be employed to counter other infidelities, such as liberal biblical scholarship. So what then characterized this new and versatile philosophy with the unassuming sobriquet of common sense? Briefly, Scottish common sense was characterized by the following. First, it was a philosophy largely concerned with the mind, and it involved a high degree of conscious self-examination. Reid points out a number of the inherent difficulties of self-observation, but ultimately sees it as the most reliable means of accessing the truths about the mind. We can't observe on any other minds. If we're going to study the mind, the only one we got that we can really study, it's our own. So anything that's going to have to deal with it is going to be a very self-conscious, of a self-conscious nature. Second, Scottish common sense is based on a series of what Dugald Stewart, one of Reid's students, was to call first principles, or intuitive truths, which must be understood as inherently unprovable. This is not to say that reason is not usable, as many critics of first principles contend, but that reason itself cannot be foundational, but grounded in what are ultimately unprovable assumptions. Reid, throughout his writings, provides several lists of these principles, sometimes lists of 12, sometimes of 15. A good example of one of these would be that those things do really exist, which we distinctly perceive by our senses, and are what we perceive them to be. So he says, you can't prove that by reason, it's just a principle that you have to take. Third, and in tandem with the second, just as we know intuitively things about the physical world without reason, so too do we know intuitively things about the ethical and moral world. Finally, he says, we come to know the truths about consciousness, the physical world, ethics, and religion to any depth through strict induction from the irreducible facts of experience. And this idea of induction really is coming out of Bacon, Francis Bacon. From a Reformed Orthodox perspective, there are definite positives to Scottish common sense. It posits a system of philosophy which can have a place for God, and it affirms the objective reality of the world and our ability to apprehend it reliably. In the negative, it has been asserted it posits a strikingly high regard for anthropology, a high view of man and our own ability to reason. It denies that the quality of our knowledge is determined not merely by our intellects alone, but also the moral character and disposition of our hearts. It also ignores the noetic effects of sin. This is, it ignores the fact that that we are in our minds and as well as our bodies and wills corrupted by original sin. and the necessity of the Spirit to enable fallen sinners to see, know, and act rightly. In short, despite the strong affirmative qualities, there are many aspects of Scottish common sense which could severely compromise a reformed orthodoxy. This must come into mind as we examine the case of Alexander. Now, the biographical of Alexander. What we know of the life of Archibald Alexander comes primarily from the very substantial biography written by his son, James Waddell Alexander, also a professor at Princeton, a very well-known revivalist preacher, especially in New York City, and a brilliant writer of letters. Actually, one of the leading experts on J.W. Alexander is our own Gary Stewart from CCU, but who happens is not to be here today, but he's written extensively on J.W. Alexander was born on 17th of April 1772 in Rockbridge County, Virginia, not far from Lexington. Of Scots-Irish descent, Alexander was named after his paternal grandfather, a man who had been converted during the First Great Awakening. The third of 9 children, Alexander grew up in a pious household. In 1776, the year that the American Revolution broke out, his father purchased several convict servants from Britain who were sent to work off their punishments in the New World. Remarkably, these convicts would be Alexander's first teachers. So his father purchased some convict criminals and then had them educate his children. Talk about hardcore homeschooling. They would teach him from the Bible and the Westminster Catechism. So they don't make criminals like they used to, apparently, either. I don't know what's going on here. That's the part. I just had to insert that because this just has some interesting information here. At the age of 10, he was sent away to the newly established Liberty Hall Academy, not far from his home. This school was run by William Graham, a graduate of Princeton who had studied under Witherspoon, and he would turn out to be Alexander's most significant and influential teacher. Alexander would, through his life, regard Graham as the chief instrument employed by Providence in educing and disciplining his faculties. Graham had modeled Liberty Hall's curriculum after that of Princeton College, and Alexander would later say that his education under Graham would have been identical to that under Witherspoon. Alexander used the same textbooks as at Princeton, and he even had to transcribe Witherspoon's lectures on moral philosophy. Though, when later Alexander expressed interest in going to Princeton to continue his education under Witherspoon directly, Graham was unexpectedly discouraging, convincing Alexander to continue his studies under him at at Lexington. When he was 19, Alexander noted that William Graham had suddenly become an avid reader of the works of Reid and Beatty. James Beatty was the student, or one of the popularizers of Thomas Reid, which had just been published within the previous few years. Soon, Graham would develop his own system based on the writings of the Scottish philosophers, which he would employ in his own teaching. Alexander also notes about himself that it was at this time he developed an interest in the philosophy of mind, which he would maintain for the rest of his life. Alexander would later describe Graham's method of teaching and his employment of common sense presuppositions and methods. He noted that Graham carried on his investigations of the mind by a patient and repeated analysis of the various processes of thought as these arose in his own mind, and by reducing the phenomena thus observed to a regular system. Yet Alexander was not uncritical of his teacher, Graham's method. He notes that while Graham was strictly orthodox in his faith, in his method of explaining some of the knotty points in theology, he departed considerably from the common track, judging that many things which have been involved in perplexity and obscurity by the manner in which they have been treated are capable of easy and satisfactory explanation by the use of sound principles of philosophy. Elsewhere, Alexander finds Graham's innovative use of this philosophy compromising to his Calvinistic theology. For example, while Graham held to the orthodox view of justification as imputed righteousness, he saw faith not as something initiated and sustained by regeneration, but simply a belief of the truth under a spiritual apprehension of its nature. Alexander in these passages appears to be at pains to assure the reader that Graham was for the most part sound in his theology, though he clearly is distressed by some of the avenues taken by his teacher. Distressed or no, within a couple of years of graduating from Liberty Hall and beginning his youthful career as an itinerant preacher in Virginia, Alexander made sure that the works of Reid and Beatty were among his early purchases of books. In addition, as Lefferts Lesher notes, Alexander early on in his preaching exhorted his hearers to the common sense practice of attending to the exercise of your own minds when considering mental qualities such as moral inability. After 2 decades of preaching and teaching in Virginia and Philadelphia, including also a stint of 9 years as president of Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia, which still is certainly there in Virginia today, Alexander was made the first professor and principal of Princeton Theological Seminary in 1812, the year that the seminary was founded. In the move to form the new seminary, which was being created out of Princeton College, he was given support by Archibald Green, probably the leading Reformed exponent and figure in Philadelphia at the time, and also in 1812 he would become the president of Princeton College as well, and Samuel Miller, a New York minister who would eventually become Princeton Seminary's second professor. He became the professor of what we today see as church history, largely. A number of factors led to the formation of this new seminary, which we can go into. A lot of it has to do with simply they were developing new professions in the college, and they decided we needed to move ministry out of it. But one of the other key reasons for the formation of a new seminary was dissatisfaction among conservative elements with the college's ministerial education, the way it had been being taught previously, and especially the college's then president, Samuel Stanhope Smith. Under Smith, the college had begun to cater more to students who had scientific and liberal arts pursuits than rather than ministerial ones. But in addition, there had also been concern with Smith's adoption of new curricula in the theology program as well. One of the first to publicly voice concern over these theological adaptations was Alexander himself, which he did at the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in 1808. There he noted, "The great extension of the physical sciences and the taste and fashion of the age have given such a shape and direction to the academical course that, I confess, it appears to me to be little adapted to introduce a youth to the study of the sacred scriptures." What those fashions of the age were specifically was unclear. But as has been pointed out, Smith was the key figure introducing common sense to Princeton. For the next 40 years until his death in 1851, Alexander served as principal and professor of didactic and polemic theology at the seminary. He mainly taught courses which today would be classified as systematic theology and apologetics. He was also the professor who taught the senior course in moral philosophy. Moral philosophy was the capstone course taken by the senior or graduating class of the institution. It was generally, moral philosophy was always the capstone course in the 19th century of the undergraduate education. Every senior in undergraduate was required to take the moral philosophy course, but it also got put into the Princeton Seminary as well. It was generally the most intellectually rigorous course at the college or seminary, and it was almost always taught by the college president. It was also the place where any idiosyncrasy of the teacher could flourish. Quite interesting. The alleged purpose of the moral philosophy course was to provide a morally prepared professional or clerical class. But in reality, it served a wide variety of purposes depending on the predilections of the president. So moral philosophy was kind of a big nebulous term, and it was really up to the president to decide what was going in, what text to use, what direction it was going. That's why what made it so idiosyncratic. It's whatever your preferences were. It was not a regimented structure, generally speaking. Typically what defined it were the writings of Scottish common sense philosophers, which made up a good proportion of the course content. But as the 19th century wore on, these texts increasingly began to be replaced by American texts written by the professors who had taught moral philosophy. So usually these presidents who would teach it eventually replaced Reid and Beatty and Dugald-Stewart with their own works. And the two best-known books in the 19th century were Francis Wayland's book on moral philosophy, the best-selling one, which sold over 200,000 copies in the 19th century. And the second most popular was Alexander's book, Outlines of Moral Science, which was published posthumously. Despite the diversity of each course, there were at least 4 common characteristics. The course was always taught by a Protestant minister, so it was usually the president, and the president was almost always a Protestant minister. Secondly, the object of the course was to propose principles to enable a rational and reflecting mind to deduce the point of duty for itself. Third, it was to provide theoretical and practical ethics. And fourth, it largely encompassed in embryo many of or all of the modern social sciences. Moral philosophy in this guise would not survive past the Civil War era. Its many internal components would be broken off to form more specialized courses, primarily in the areas of ethics, political philosophy, psychology, sociology, and the like. So that's what happened. Moral philosophy is not taught anymore because now we have psych courses and sociology courses and political philosophy courses. So it gives you kind of a range of the diversity. You go into moral philosophy and you talk politics and ethics and psychology. And depending on who your professor is, there's going to be accent on one or the other. Obviously, as we're going to see with Alexander, one of the key interests was certainly what we call mental philosophy. Alexander was the first and almost definitely the last professor to teach the course in moral philosophy at Princeton Seminary. He taught it up until his death in 1851, and we really don't have any record of anybody taking over that. In fact, we have one record of his son, J.A. Alexander, who was also a professor there, saying, I remember in the good old days, remember when Dad used to teach moral philosophy. So he was the only guy that taught moral philosophy at Princeton Seminary. All right, we're wrapping up quickly here. Alexander's use of Scottish common sense. In developing his own lectures on moral and mental philosophy, we are told by his biographer that Alexander expressed great favor for Thomas Reid, James Beatty, Dugald-Stewart, as well as George Campbell and the French Jesuit common sense philosopher Claude Bouffier. He further notes that Alexander employed their methods, specifically the inductive method, with mental phenomena, as well as common sense intuitive truths and constitutional first principles. Yet, he also observes that Alexander dissented from these thinkers in terms of many of their definitions, distinctions, and tenets. Looking at Alexander's lecture notes at Princeton Seminary, even in a cursory way, the influence of Scottish common sense becomes readily apparent. And this is one of these points that I think a lot of the neo-reform people who want to hold up the Princetonians as great reformed thinkers who weren't influenced by Scottish common sense, it really falls apart. Because when you look at the notes, and I've been sort of scanning through so many of them, Scottish common sense is everywhere in them. They're constantly mentioning the names of Reid and Beatty appear throughout the writings, certainly, but we see he has lectures. For example, one of his major lectures called The Active Powers of the Human Mind, which is the exact same title of one of Reid's most important books. And we even have, I actually have discovered not too long ago amongst the notes, Alexander's actual notes that he took when reading Thomas Reid's major work, the Essays on the Intellectual Powers of Man. So we actually have his notes that he was taking while reading Reid. How then did he utilize Scottish common sense in his teaching? In the archive, we have a sampling of student notebooks containing the lectures. Now, this is where I'm just going to minimize. I'm just going to look at one sample piece as opposed to starting. I'm in the process of developing a more comprehensive look at how, so this is where we're sort of taking off into more speculative realms. But just to give you one sample, I discovered one student notebook, and I'm just from the opening pages of it. This is a note, and this is an important notebook from a student from the academic year of 1841 to 42, which is also helpful to go to the student notebooks because Alexander never dated any of his notes, which is just a warning to some of you. For future reference, it's kind of a mess when you're looking at all these and it's like, is this early career or late career? It's been making my job a little difficult. And the only way we can guide it is that we have some student notebooks, which help to give us a little bit of comprehensibility. The student notebook is titled Dr. Alexander's Lectures on Mental and Moral Philosophy. And we shall be able to see clear signs of Scottish common sense, but also its interaction, or at least its mention of Alexander's theological concerns. The lecture opened with Alexander, and it really, when you read them, the lecture notes aren't like you'd think typical student notes of just sort of sketching points down. They read as comprehensive essays. So this is one of the things I haven't been able to quite figure out, like, did he just give them the notes and then they just directly copied them? Or did he read it out? I mean, it's all in complete sentences and paragraphs. It's like student notes you've never seen in your life. Really, it's really quite. And actually, the handwriting. The other nice thing is the students' handwriting tends to be much better than Alexander's. So just a little interesting little point. Very different world we live in. The lecture opens with Alexander giving a general encouragement to thought. He says, "Be diligent in acquiring a habit of thinking for yourselves," he urges. He then goes on to speak of intuitive self-evident truths, or first principles. He says, "Intuitive truths cannot be proved by reasoning because one can find no idea more simple by which to make it plainer. They are innate in the sense that they are impressed upon the mind previous to any exercise of our faculties." He even divides these innate truths into the same two categories that Reid does. And Reid, he does have I didn't mention that, I mean, again, just for the survey, but Reid makes a very distinct point about these different first principles, and he makes a big argument about what he calls necessary and probable truths, or necessary and probable first principles. And Alexander makes the same distinction. In a section titled "The Limits of Mental Science," he shows further marks of Scottish common sense. He tells us we should endeavor to acquire a habit of introspection, thereby making the process a conscious one by steadily fixing the attention upon our intellectual exercises. Again, this self-reflexive habit of looking at how the mind works itself. Citing Bacon directly, Alexander notes, "The proper method of pursuing the study of mental philosophy is to employ the inductive method. And thereby we must note exactly the facts and then classify them, then endeavor to draw correct conclusions." Within the first few pages of his lectures on mental and moral philosophy, we can see three of the leading characteristics of Scottish common sense that I have already mentioned: conscious introspection, a regard for first principles, and the inductive method of investigation. So clearly Alexander is showing himself, at least he's declaring himself, as Scottish common sense in all these principles. Within these same pages, however, Alexander, and this is where this is the thing that I'm working on now, is how are they fitting together? Alexander makes three significant points with regard to his mental philosophy and its relation to theology. First is that mental philosophy is important in connection with theology. The mind is the subject of theology, he states. Next, he notes that intellectual pursuits must not supersede religious ones. He writes, "Be careful that intellectual pursuits are not suffered to diminish the depth of your doctrinal feelings. There is no subject that does not furnish matter for moral reflection and devout meditation, but theological subjects are prominent in this respect." And finally, he informs us that despite our ambitions, we must be cautious and recognize there are limitations on our intellectual investigations. He says, "Recollect the imbecility of the human mind. God has placed a barrier beyond which we cannot pass in the investigation of truth. It is important to understand these limits. I have known some young men to ruin themselves by attempting to pursue the study of things beyond the reach of the human mind." I wonder what that looked like. No man can attain universal knowledge. We must leave parts of science unexplored. For Alexander, moral philosophy must occur within the larger project of theology proper. Theology makes us aware of the fact that when it comes to matters of morals and faith, more than intellect is required. This is his second point. Doctrinal feelings imply the implication of a faithful heart, and we see this idea of the role of heart coming elsewhere in other aspects of Alexander's writing. Finally, the pursuit of truth has external limitations as well. I do not think this is a call to willful ignorance, but a recognition of divine goodness in limiting us to what is necessary for our own goodness. Again, so preliminary but concluding remarks. From this, I think we can see ample demonstration of a commitment to Scottish common sense principles and methods. It is not at all obscure in his notes, and it is clearly evident in his teaching of moral philosophy at Princeton. Alexander appeals to conscious self-examination. He argues from first principles, and he asserts the use of inductive reasoning, even if we have not had the opportunity of seeing demonstration of employment of these principles and methods in this short paper. Furthermore, we have not yet seen what J.W. Alexander calls dissent from Reidian definitions, distinctions, and tenets. Again, one of the things that I'm sort of elucidating right now. Nevertheless, what is also of significance is his assertion of these aspects of Scottish common sense within the context of theological purposes and limitations. So what then is the difference between cultivating a natural theology and capitulating to an Enlightenment philosophy? Why is what Samuel Stanhope Smith did, which was basically apply Scottish common sense to many of the same moral philosophy topics as Alexander did, considered compromising to the taste and the fashion of the age, but what Alexander did considered valid and within the Reformed tradition? This needs to be examined more closely. But I will wager that the answer has to do with assessing how far their incorporation of Scottish common sense was carried through into their theology. J.W. Alexander at one point mentions that his father felt that no theological education was complete without reference to the Scottish philosophers, but only in the sense that they served as a, quote, preliminary to the development of the revealed system. I'm wondering if there's something key in that phrase, that this is the preliminary to the revealed system. It's not perhaps explaining the revealed system, but how is that preliminary as opposed to, exegeting it? I don't know. It is in this sense that I think we can begin to understand Alexander as developing a natural theology. How this can be more amply demonstrated, I leave to open discussion right now. In that light, I conclude with a quote from David Van Drunen. Early American Presbyterian proponents of common sense incorporated Scottish philosophy into their thought in ways that concurred with their own tradition's teaching on natural law. This conclusion points in a somewhat different direction from the claims of those who conclude that common sense realism and Reformed theology were at odds, the people I was talking about from the early 20th century, particularly in their respective optimistic and pessimistic views of human nature. So I believe, Van Drunen, you're pointing out that sort of the difference of how this optimism, pessimism might be something of an indicator as well. So there you go.
Okay, we've got some good time here in terms of questions. Food won't come out for another half an hour or so. So let's have some good discussion. It's probably appropriate, considering that the lecture concluded with a quote from Dr. Van Drunen, that the question and answers can then begin with him. So, and then we'll just pass the mic around as we did the last section.
I sort of feel an obligation to ask the first question.
I didn't really call you out here on this.
No. Thank you for this. This is very interesting and helpful, and I look forward to seeing where this all ends up.
Yep.
Let me. There was something I've been thinking about in the course of your paper, and then the very last paragraph, right before the last quote from me, there was a second thing that maybe I want to raise at some point, but in something that I think I mentioned to you last night in our dinner conversation, that I had written something last year. There was an article I was asked to write in which I revisited a little bit some of these issues that I had written a little bit about in the book from which you quote, and I added a thought there in this more recent thing that's not yet published that I didn't have in the book from which you quote. So I just want to tell you what my additional thought is. I think it's consistent with what you're doing here, but I'd be curious what you think of this. So it's going to be a question in the form of telling you this idea that I had.
Yeah.
I don't think it's brilliant or anything. This is a little different way that I was thinking about looking at this. And okay, so if you think about the earlier Reformed tradition, I think it's fair to say, and there are a lot of other people who say this, that it was philosophically eclectic. Right? I mean, there was no that the earlier Reformed theologians, they didn't embrace one particular philosophical system. So they used a lot of Aristotelian ideas. But they weren't pure Aristotelians or something. You know,
Yep.
They used things from philosophical systems, from philosophers that they thought were useful for explaining certain aspects of their theological system. Now, part of the reason I was thinking in these terms was because in this article I was asked to write, I was also going to be thinking about some of these later Reformed thinkers, especially in neo-Calvinist circles, where you have this idea that there has to be some sort of distinctively Reformed philosophy. So with Doyeweerd and others, you get this idea, okay, you're not supposed to be borrowing, you're not supposed to be being Aristotelian or things like that. You need to have a distinctively Christian philosophy. And I don't think that was the way that the earlier Reformed theologians were thinking. They were eclectic. And so when these old Princeton theologians were coming along, they weren't thinking in terms of we need to develop a distinctively Reformed philosophy to accompany our theology. They were kind of doing the eclectic thing. And so if they were thinking, okay, you know, what are the philosophical ideas that are kind of out here, are available to us? And now, given the idea that they have this long tradition of a natural theology, to kind of pick up what you're suggesting here, all right, we have to have some sort of natural theology. That's part of our broader theological system. We're not going to be, Hume's not going to be an attractive philosophical, I mean, you're not going to develop a natural theology through Hume. Kant's not really, he's not going to be your man. But the common sense realism, it kind of, okay, I mean, because it's a kind of a realism, it's useful in ways that a lot of the other kind of contemporary alternatives wouldn't be. So it kind of makes sense in that way. Whereas then when you have the kind of neo-Kuyperian thing comes along, then that whole way of thinking gets kind of put out the door. And that makes sense why some of the, particularly the intra-reformed critics of the old Princeton, a lot of it's driven by this, I think, this kind of neo-Calvinist idea. Well, you're compromising kind of de facto if you're using these not specifically reformed philosophical systems. So I'm sorry for the long way of putting it, but it's not really fresh on my mind. I wrote this, I don't know, last summer or something, so I'm trying to work it out as I'm speaking. But I guess I'm
quote?
just... Pardon?
Can you send me the quote? I'll use it.
Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
so I guess I'd just be curious what you think of that idea and that kind of eclectic approach, and just this was kind of useful. And
It's very, I mean, the way you're phrasing it is sounding very much like the concept of bricolage. I don't know if you're from cultural studies. The bricolage, when you're a bricoleur, you're basically, it's becoming actually quite trendy in a lot of kind of a, trendy and Reformed theology don't often go together. But where it is exactly this very practical appropriation of tools that are literally around you. The bricolage is somebody who's just whatever happens to be around you. In a magpie fashion. There's no systematic co-opting of something, fully into the system. And that's the thing is that I also noticed. I didn't really, just for time, I didn't mention it. But Peterson actually mentions, he says that the Scottish philosophy was used by all of these people, the like I said, the Unitarians, the Transcendentalists, the New Divinity guys at Yale, and Princeton. They all were using it, but he says it was never, I mean, now how you demonstrate this, I don't know, but he said it was never the dominant aspect of their philosophy. It was always sort of there, but it was never really, you know, it wasn't, they didn't become, we're Scottish common sense. It was like, we're still Transcendentalists or we're still Unitarian, but we've got this kind of worked in there. So in that regard, it seems to make sense. I don't know what is it that happened in the 20th century that suddenly you do got that sort of sense that you must have this kind of purist, hermetically sealed off entity, you know, Reformed theology, which is so complete in its understanding that, you know, you can't have any kind of, you know, innovations coming from outside philosophical systems. I mean, where did that develop? But you're right, that mentality, I think, has it affects the way when we reflect back. I mean, I think this is what a lot of these thinkers, like especially like a Mark Knoll, or a Letcher, when they're looking back, not to say that they're kind of purist Reformed thinkers, but they look back and say, oh, these guys, you know, this is a compromising or whatever. But for them, that was just the way you did things. You just simply took from what, and I'm wondering if that's another thing about natural theology, that we're kind of we're almost elevating it to like this sort of grandiose project, but it was in a sense just a very down on the ground practical thing. I don't know, is that making some sense?
It does, and I think that'd be worth pursuing more. I think it's important to remember that the, you know, there are a lot of things coming into my mind here that, you know, they wouldn't. It fits Reformed theology to say that, you know, thanks to God's common grace or some other equivalent term, that people outside Reformed or Christian circles altogether are discovering certain truths about the world, but we also realize that they're never going to get everything right. They're going to make a lot of errors along the way. Yep. So this kind of selectivity really fits a kind of Reformed perspective, I would say, recognizing that there's truth, but not, you know, needing to, you know, you wouldn't want to wholly embrace it. So yeah, that sounds. I kind of like I think I like what you're saying.
I'm also wondering if that is going to be fitting into a lot of, you know, the kind of thinking you're seeing with people like Oliver Crisp now too, sort of talking more about, you know, there isn't the reform. I mean, you know, that feeds into this. It's no longer the Reformed tradition, but many kinds of Reformed theology as well. That there is greater. I mean, not only is it practical, but there's a great deal more diversity. I'm wondering if those two different ideas are kind of co-supportive of one another as well.
Perhaps, although he's thinking more doctrinally, I think, than the kind of the use of tools.
Right.
Helpful. Since I have the mic, could I just say one other brief thing?
Sure.
At the last paragraph, so almost the last thing you say before that final quote, is the you talk about this use of the Scottish philosophers in the sense that they served as a preliminary to the development of the revealed system.
Yep, that's a quote from Alexander.
Yeah, and I just wonder, I mean, is that a way of talking about the preambula fide that you have in that Thomas uses? I think, again, the historically classical Reformed theology does have some kind of idea of the preambula fide, and I think I was kind of getting at that at the end of my lecture last night with respect that natural law is, it provides certain things that are in a way preambles to the faith, you know, that certain knowledge about God and the world and about our moral responsibilities, and that it's not that Scripture doesn't talk about these things as well, but there are certain things that we know as human beings, thanks to the way God has made us and made the world, that have this kind of foundational character that in some ways our larger system of doctrine rests upon. So I don't know. I just the term preambula fide popped into my head when I heard you read that quote.
Yeah. Well, it just sort of, again, I mean, I think maybe you're also pointing to another factor. I think we were talking, John Wind and you and myself last night. I mean, when you mentioned that at Westminster, California, was that you have 4 hours dedicated to prolegomena in your courses. And it's funny that when you look at a lot of the earlier tradition going back to the 19th century and the like, that when you look at Reformed theology, there's a huge amount given to prolegomena. And that seems to disappear. I mean, 20th century, I mean, not to, just pick on, but, like looking at like somebody like a Wayne Grudem nowadays where you don't have, virtually any prolegomena going on. And I'm wondering if that whole question of the role of prolegomena, is fitting into that, like what, that there's actually this sort of space that's been created within Reformed theology. I don't know. I'm not an expert on how on 20th century how 20th century theology has sort of worked out in Reformed thought, but I was wondering. I do seem to sense that there's been more of a diminishment of that, and you're fitting. I'm not explaining that very well. I'm just simply making an observation based on what you're saying.
No, I think it's an intriguing observation. I think there may be something to it.
Hey.
Hello. Kind of taking it actually back to the 20th century theology, I'm just kind of noticing almost a cyclic effect of how the minds of different theological movements are going. And so as we moved into, I think it was probably more of a fundamentalist in the 19th century, and then almost a neo-evangelicalism in the late 20th century, which seems to me to be more eclectic. And then now it's almost as if we're cycling. But it's just this constant cycle, it seems like. But I feel like I have been noticing that we're almost coming to an end of this neo-evangelical era, I would say. And I'm wondering if you saw that as being more eclectic, and then we are entering into more of a resurge of the more reformed piece again.
Always good to make general and sweeping assessments of culture. The answer is, I guess, yes and no. But yes, in the sense of we see areas of this sort of thing. You're talking about this resurgence of Reformed. I think, something like what we're doing even here today. What the Davenant Trust is all about. Getting a little plug for Davenant here. But that's exactly that we're starting to see these kinds of, this retrieval kind of thing happening. I think, I don't know if I would, it's tricky characterizing things as cyclical when you're dealing with history, because history is just, historians, you can back me up on this, but it's always, history is always so different that yes, you can sort of see similarities, but to talk it in a cyclical way is very, you have to be very cautionary about that. But I think, what you're seeing nowadays, is, I think simply you're seeing the effects. If they're I don't know if they're cyclical, but they're just the simple effect that there's been a dearth of any kind of richness of learning and knowledge. I think this is one of the things what you're seeing is a couple of generations at least of evangelicals who have become mentally more engaged and have seen a lot of the vacuity in what they've been raised with, and are trying to, and suddenly discovering, you find that you either go to some other tradition, you become, Eastern Orthodox, or you're finding out that, wait a minute, maybe my faith actually has a lot more than I've given it thought to before. And so I think, that's what you're just sort of seeing is that you're seeing these sort of people, frankly, just starved of any kind of robust theology that can give their evangelical lives any kind of meaning. And so that's what I would characterize it more as that, I think. Again, we're talking very sweeping, because frankly, you see when you look at the culture at large, there seems to be an enormous amount of vacuity still out there. You still have, the Joel Osteen churches still seem to be packing them in quite readily. So it's hard to suddenly, I think it's just that you're always going to see those little there's always going to be, if you look at it in certain ways, you're going to see a lot of bad, but then if you look in the right way, you're going to find these sparks or whatever that are kind of occurring. I think, like I said, what we're doing, even as part of this, is just a very helpful, very an encouraging sign that, like, wait a minute, we're looking back and we're finding out, wow, there was a lot more to what we've had in the past than we thought there was. It's kind of general, but yeah. Sam?
Yes, I'm not super informed about common sense realism. I'm getting the impression from your talk and from what David said that it was sort of used as like a set of tools, like philosophical tools.
Yep.
But then I am super stuck on page 16 where you have the quote that, well, first of all, mental philosophy and moral philosophy being conflated is extremely confusing to me. Yep. And then
they are conflated in an extremely confusing way. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
but
you are confused in probably the precise way you should be. Yep.
Good.
Yep.
The mind is the subject of theology. I
haven't teased that out. Have I? No. Nope, and I left that deliberately.
Like, surely God is the subject of theology, right? So I'm wondering, is this some kind of like Kantian, like we can't reach God, we can't like really know metaphysics with our minds, and so we're looking at our own minds to see like what traces might be there or something like that? Or because I was getting the sense from this talk that maybe common sense realism, and correct me because I'm sure I'm wrong, is sort of an answer to a lot of Enlightenment questions. Like Descartes says, let's question whether our senses achieve reality, and they're like, let's not. And Hume says, we don't really know causation, and they're like, yes, we do. I mean, is that wrong? That's probably
no.
Wrong.
That's actually right. No, you've got it very close.
But then Kant's like, well, we can't achieve metaphysics with our mind. No. This sounds like that.
First, a few points. There's a lot there, so I'm just going to break it down.
Sorry.
First of all, to answer the mental and moral philosophy question, they're used interchangeably. Mental philosophy often seems to be more often referred to when you get into the specifics of psychology within moral philosophy. So moral philosophy generally encompasses the larger body, which would include things like ethics and even politics. But it's still fairly nebulous in the way that they're using it. So often you will see articles or pieces written by Alexander, which will call themselves moral philosophy, and he might be talking about mental philosophy. And then he'll have pieces called mental philosophy where he's talking about mental philosophy. But sometimes he'll have pieces that are called moral philosophy where he'll be talking about apologetics and politics and that sort of thing. That's why I said it's really eclectic. It is fitting this sort of category. Maybe this is something to say to it. Why did every school had a course in moral philosophy. It was the premier class, but it had an eclecticism to it, which is interesting. Secondly, the passage that you're quoting from, I'm in the process currently of transcribing. So I'll be I can get it to you so we can sort of look at more comprehensively once I finish the transcription. Everything I've been sort of quoting from is outside of JW's book. I've been working from, like I said, handwritten documents. So this is part of this is what's slowing my research down, especially, like I said, with Alexander himself. It's very obscure. But thirdly, I think Ian raised his hand. So what? Oh, sorry. Were you going to address that question of? Okay, but the question, I like, honestly, if we could just even open this up so that I'm not just the only guy here talking. But the idea that which you just sort of said that the mind is the subject of theology. Did you have something to say on that, or?
I was just wondering. There's a Scottish philosophy. There's also a Scottish theology, which is called Sandemanianism. John Glass and Robert Sandeman are the two key guys behind that. Glass's dates, he's born in the 1690s, and the whole idea, even throwing back to what we were talking about earlier with the threefold distinction of faith with the fiducial element to it as the third, they tend to deny that, and that for them saving faith for Sandemanians is basically just a census. And so I just wondered then, when you have that quote, when as soon as I heard that quote, I too jotted in my notes Sandemanianism, and just wondered if there's a Sandemanian stream that's coming in to Graham that Archibald Alexander is picking up on and critiquing, maybe.
But that actually, I mean, I had my previous quote. I didn't develop it fully, but Alexander recognizes exactly that. Like that I mentioned that quote from Graham. Graham basically sees faith as intellectual assent, and Alexander calls him on it. So that leaves
something
that.
So very then distinctly reformed in doing that, and classical.
Yeah, he's and that's where, like, I mean, and you do see that, I mean, and Alexander becomes very heavily preoccupied with the topic of regeneration. So he can't, I don't think it can mean that, in the sense that there's kind of, so what's going on there? I don't know, but it just kind of, but I think what he's doing, I mean, part of what maybe he's just doing in a rhetorical way of saying, ultimately, don't forget, guys, even though we're dealing with this, that this is within the larger context of theology. Maybe that's, I'm still, it's enigmatic, I know. Yeah.
I just had this piggybacking off of what David said about the preambula fide, and why is it that in the 20th century we seem to have gotten rid of that. And we want a theology philosophy that's self-contained and all-encompassing. Just reminded me of this quote from this fantastic book, C.S. Lewis on Politics and Natural Law. Okay. I just wanted to share.
Sorry, what book is it again?
C.S. Lewis on Politics and the Natural Law.
Okay.
Yeah. So it relates well to David's lecture last night. So it says, Lewis distanced himself from those who would claim, quote, the world must return to Christian ethics in order to preserve civilization, or even in order to save human species from destruction. The truth of the matter, according to Lewis, was the reverse. Instead of returning to Christian ethics, the world must simply return to a belief in real objective morality. Only then would it be able to return to Christianity. For, quote, Christianity is not the promulgation of a moral discovery. It is addressed only to penitents, only to those who admit their disobedience to the known moral law. It offers forgiveness for having broken and supernatural help towards keeping that law, and by so doing reaffirms it. The challenge faced by the modern world is that many people deny that morality has any objective basis at all.
Yeah, this is, it's kind of, what page is that, by the way? Just out of curiosity for future reference. 45, okay. Yeah, no, just, but you're saying that engagement with the world, and this is actually a point, again, I was sharing this with David and John last night. Like I said, one of the problems, I mean, I said, a lot of North American scholars have really seen this Scottish common sense in a negative way. It made it rationalistic. There's no piety. I mean, this is the whole thing of Knoll and Alstrom and Lesher and all the like. But this summer, I was actually over in the Netherlands, and I was talking with a scholar at the VU University, one of my supervisors, in fact, a guy by the name of Gijsbert van den Brink, who's done a lot of work on studying. I mean, he's a big scholar on Bavinck, but he's also been looking at Warfield. And he actually made an interesting point, because he's like, because we were talking about the fact that a lot of recent people like Helseth and Fred Zaspel are saying there's no Scottish common sense. Look away, there's nothing there. And he agrees. He said, I don't find that convincing. He says they're using Scottish common sense. And he made the argument, he said, in Europe, he said, and he says, maybe this is often good to get some outsider perspective. He was saying that in Europe, he said you had that whole Kuyperian tradition which came in, which basically saw Christianity as a complete system. And unless you're a truly regenerate person, you're not going to understand the truths of Christianity. And it kind of closed off, in his view, he thought, the church from the world around it. And it just sort of became that kind of contained unit. It never interacted. He said, whereas in America, you have this tradition of, like, I mean, you still have, people who are going to, argue for, questions on creation and evolution or the authority of Scripture, but in the public sphere, in the public square, that you actually have that evidentialist apologetics. And he sees that coming out of the common sense. He said, at the very least, the common sense has allowed, that was interesting. He said, at the very least, it's allowed, common sense has allowed Christianity to have a vigorous public square presence. Whereas, he says, the Reformed tradition that you see coming out of Doyeweerd and Kuyper and the like really hermetically sealed the church off, and he says massively to its detriment. I mean, this is just one scholar talking. It's not based on any surveys. But I thought that was an interesting, the Americans see this as sort of this dry and dusty way of making religion rational. And he's saying, well, no, it's actually kept it vigorous and vital. So, and I think it's feeding off of what you're just saying with Lewis, that there's somehow there, and again, that whole prolegomena, this can be a feeder of people into the faith. I mean, how many people, when you think of it, who became Christian in their adult life, there were often sort of rational evidentialist arguments that played a role. And I mean, Alexander, he's developing this theory, but he's also working very strongly in apologetics as well. And that's really coloring his way of understanding the human mind. Oh, yeah.
Our first speaker last night read from the prophets, and he and those passages really spoke of practical wisdom,
Yep.
practicality.
Yep.
How would you respond to the statement that Scottish common sense realism may be the closest philosophy expressed in the Old Testament, and as such, it's a pedagogy for the New Testament, and therefore maybe common sense realism may be the ideal philosophy to merge or in support theology?
Way out of my depth. I can only speak to what David Van Drunen said earlier, that certainly for Reformed biblically minded Christians in the 18th century, I have no idea how Old Testament prophets would see it. I've not seen anything where Scottish common sense has been brought into dialogue with Old Testament. But I would say that given the options of the day in the 18th century, early 19th century, they clearly saw that this philosophy, more than Humean skepticism or Kantian idealism, was the best fit. Is it the best philosophy? I mean, we're talking, first of all, there are problems, like I said, that would probably tell me no. I mean, that it isn't the most perfect system. I remember looking at Reid, he's very much, he has a very high anthropology. And in fact, this is one of the arguments, Thomas Unnert just recently wrote a book talking about the history of the moderates and the Orthodox in Scotland. And he was comparing people like Reid. And there's been that division that many people actually make the argument that, well, there's Orthodox people like John Witherspoon, and they maintain the robust tradition. But then the moderates are ones that actually, that they just sort of accommodated the Enlightenment thought. Unnert actually makes the argument that what actually drove the moderates was not just this coercion of Enlightenment thought. What they were doing, the issue that divided them was on the issue of justification, which is interesting because, so people like, Reid's predecessor, especially a guy by the name of George Turnbull, for example, was actually making the arguments, and this was we've seen this in their, even in their sermons and that the problem was justification was, this promoting of justification was allowing for antinomianism. And so we need to develop, we need to show that human beings have a greater responsibility to morally behave. And so this is what I think boosts their anthropology. They're actually, this is an interesting new theory that's just been on the last couple of years that's been tied up. A lot of people just think they're just capitulating to Enlightenment, but in fact they seem to be, there was a huge division within the Scottish Church over the doctrine of justification and antinomianism. And the moderates were very reticent, very much strongly reacting to what they saw as antinomianism, and they did so by developing this higher anthropology. No human beings have the ability to be good. They didn't. That's so. I'm spelling this out to say there are still some serious theological problems with common sense, at least in its foundational structure. Does that help? I mean, I can point you to where the literature on this is sort of later, if you like, which really sort of gives you that stronger sense. And I mean, and even Alexander elsewhere says there are big problems with it. That's why I'm saying, of the options, it's probably the best, but it's still a human philosophy. It's not the revealed. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Mike. That's very interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. My question actually sort of piggybacks on this last question. So I'm going to give, I guess I'm just going to give a reason why you might think that Scottish common sense realism, why it might be a hit, and then you can sort of tell me what you think about that. So anyway, I take it that Aristotelianism was a big hit in the Middle Ages. Why? Because it made the world intelligible. It was a way of explaining how the world is intelligible. And Scottish common sense realism is primarily something that has to do with what we know. It's epistemological. And it makes the world very intelligible, right? Look, there are chairs out there of certain colors, and we're right about this sort of thing. And this sort of generally seems to cohere with the Christian picture of the nature of reality, namely that it's ordered and it's made by a designer such that it's very intelligible to folks like us. Whereas, Humean skepticism, obviously unfriendly to that picture. Kantian transcendental idealism, obviously unfriendly to that picture. So anyway, this is just one reason you might think that Scottish common sense realism fits very well with Christianity, Christian theology, generally speaking. So, whatever.
Did you want? Or you were looking to engage with that, or? No. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry. I just didn't know. Yeah. If you wanted to, your just hand popped up. I didn't know if you had something immediately. Yeah. I mean, now I think actually, I mean, what a lot like people like Alexander Brody are now showing that. I mean, one of the things that a lot. What's been happening in the last few years is we're getting a much better picture of Scottish common sense, and I think that's been a helpful thing, because I think in the early 20th century that's also been another problem with all of this, is not just simply that they didn't like the idea of natural theology, but they just didn't understand a lot of what was going on in Scottish common sense, partly because we had most people in America unfortunately got the bad popularizers. I mentioned James Beatty. There was another guy by the name of James Oswald. That's actually how most Christians in America knew common sense. And they didn't actually read Thomas Reid. And Alexander did, which is one of the things I'm very encouraged to see, because Beatty and Oswald were known to have really, well, nowadays, even in their day, they were known to have really messed it up. They really, like for instance, they said you can have, direct and immediate access to the world, which is never what Reid says. It's, he says what we can have is true perceptions. And so, those kinds of things make a huge difference. And the question of, does it mean that there has to be a God? It's an intelligible world, therefore there must be an intelligible person. I think you can see Scottish common sense can work without a God, which is why Scottish common sense is so popular even amongst some of our secular friends, within the Center for Scottish Philosophy. But at the same time, they did come out of a root in believing in God. Reid was an ordained minister. These guys were all ordained in the Church of Scotland. They had, they had clashes with people like with Witherspoon, which is kind of the funny thing is when everybody says Witherspoon brought it over, and it's like Witherspoon and Reid would, Witherspoon never read Reid because his work came out later, but they would have been very much on opposite sides of a lot of theological issues. But nonetheless, they were, unlike Hume or Kant, they were pastors. They were ministers. And they had a lot of room for God in there. Even if I could say it can work without God, it still has a place for that. So I think you're right that it was just it just fit all of their needs, and especially since in that period in American history you were getting so much of the deist arguments coming in. In America, you started. The French. That was the whole thing. You had the French suddenly with their radical enlightenment, posing all of these challenges. And all of a sudden in America, they're like, and it's kind of, early on it's the French, and then later on the Germans with their theology is creating these big challenges. And it's like, wow, if they're so harsh, hey, at least these guys are good and they'll help us out a fair bit. We tend to be more forgiving of their faults if they're generally seen on our side. So, yep.
Yeah, well, to ask a quick follow-up,
Yep.
I guess to sort far as what epistemologies fit the Bible well, Scottish common sense realism does a pretty good job,
Yep.
whereas others don't. But maybe this is exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
It doesn't
So
necessarily give us reason to believe in God. It's just sort of the epistemology that we get from the scriptures would fit best.
yeah, one wonders if that's going to actually cause, with the revival of interest in Reid that we're seeing right now, in the last 20 years, Reid has become will evangelicals once again become interested in? So maybe your point with, maybe this is something that will be explored. I haven't done it myself, but this is, maybe there is, I mean, of all the philosophies out there, there seems to be something about it. Yep.
If I can just kind of, I'm going to try to articulate this, and you can just correct my understanding if I'm misunderstanding. Okay. It seems to me, from what I've seen, that within Reformed circles, there's this tendency to adopt a philosophy that may comport with Reformed theology, or jettison if it doesn't comport with Reformed theology. Again, maybe I'm misunderstanding what's historically happened or what's necessary. But in this talk of Reformed theologians having this sort of eclecticism regarding what philosophical foundations they're going to adopt rather than having a sort of Reformed philosophy, it seems like that has impact. If that's true, it seems like it has impact on Reformed theologians' ability to speak to, say, how we do natural science, for example, or social sciences, right? Like, what do Reformed theologians have to say to Carl Jung's, psychology, given that this is a social science, and I don't have an underlying maybe philosophical criticism, but what I have is a theological, usually within a soteriological context, criticism of Jung's psychology or something like that. Do you think that if that's true, that that's what Reformed theologians have tended to do you think that cripples Reformed theologians' ability to make criticisms of either philosophical points of view or in the natural sciences on its own terms? Does that make sense, or?
Yes.
Okay.
That's my answer. No, I think you're getting back to what David mentioned earlier. I think that's the thing that we were talking about, that early eclectic period. There wasn't this sensibility, I think, in these early reformers of doing Reformed theology in the way that you get it later. Of like now, there is the great bastion of Reformed theology, and therefore now that it's coherent and set, we must not. I think maybe that's something in itself, that eclecticism is something that we need to think about retrieving from the past. Like you said, it's funny you mentioned Jung. We had an earlier discussion this week about Jung, because we're looking at, tangentially, a guy by the name of Jordan Peterson, some of you may have heard of, has suddenly, in the Reformed blogosphere, has brought up this question of Carl Jung. Social sciences, maybe you're referring to that? I don't know. I figured. But yeah, and we're sort of like completely unprepared for this you got this whole other area of knowledge that's just sort of been sitting there. It's vast. It seems to have many great features to it. But since we are Reformed, we don't know what to do because we can't step out of that. Whereas, like I said, I don't think there was that strong self-consciousness. They were conscious of being Christians, but not that self-consciousness of having a formed Reformed theology you see in this earlier period. Help me out, anybody? On what you think?
Just as a quick thing, lunch will be shortly.
Okay.
Well, as soon as I see it, I'll
when,
run.
because
Talking until we get them come.
okay, yeah.
This is very preliminary off the top of my head. So, I guess I'm. It strikes me that for the kind of the classical Reformed theology, that it's not so much that they don't have a conception of Reformed theology. I think that seems to be there early on, but it's Reformed theology itself is to be limited in a sense to what the scriptures say. So we're trying to understand the scriptures, and so we don't want to speculate beyond the scripture. That's our system of doctrine. That's what our confessions are going to say. And there's it's not that there's not other truths or other spheres of knowledge out there, other things to explore. It's just that if these things, if they're raising questions in a sense that go beyond the scriptures, there isn't necessarily a Reformed view of those things. And so there is a Reformed theology, I think, but it's not, the Reformed theology doesn't extend beyond what Scripture addresses. And so there's a certain liberty that Christians have once we're going beyond that. We can have legitimate debates about various different parts of the world. Whereas I think that the kind of the neo-Calvinist way of looking at it is, no, there's actually has to be this Reformed view of everything. And so
Sort of
you have to have
Kuiper and his
you have
spheres
to
kind of
have
thing.
this larger Reformed philosophy that can deal with every single thing. And it seems to me that that might be the difference, and maybe that's getting at to some of what you're talking about.
Is there also a parallel here when we're thinking about something like Protestant scholasticism and the idea that, well, we're not, when we talk about scholasticism, we're talking primarily about a method of tools, as Samantha was saying earlier. Is there a parallel here too, do you think, then, in terms of, so you can have a scholastic method that's very Aristotelian or Thomistic, you can have a Ramism, and then as the Reformed tradition moves on, you can use Scottish tools in the same way. Is that a way of like kind of drawing a parallel, maybe, or?
I think so, right? In that it's that when you have differences between those using Aristotelian tools or Ramus tools, or I think the Scottish tools, that it's not really a debate about the doctrine, right? It's that we have our Reformed doctrine. What we're doing is we're trying to, okay, what tools do we have to sort of help explain it as a kind of pedagogical tools? And so maybe Aristotelian causality can be really helpful for trying to talk about certain kinds of things. So that it's not so much, these aren't strictly doctrinal, they're more, I'm not sure what exactly the right word is, but I think you're right.
I might be a little bit of an outsider in the room as someone who is studying psychology at this university. One of the big things that we talk about in the psych department is that we like what psych science has done in the secular world, but we don't always agree with the conclusions. And I think partly what you were talking about, we can use, like from my own perspective, psychology as a tool. We can delve into the scriptures and we can find all of our doctrines and all of our theology from the scriptures. And in some situations, what we've learned from psychology, assuming that parts of it were still true even all those years ago, we can expound some things out of scripture that give depth to it and give it life and make it not read as some kind of dry stories where we get this idea of a Reformed theology. And I think it's really cool. I like the idea of an eclectic gathering of ideas and information for Christianity and for theology, and I just think it's very interesting.
So I think that's a good point. But David was saying there, it's the eclecticism seems to come about with that question of liberty. I think, as you said, it's like I think that's where we sort of need to really sort of think our way through. Where do we have liberty in our thought? And maybe that's the problem with 20th century Reformed thought, was that it expanded the circles to try to be so comprehensive in its understanding of everything that it's left that we've got a biblical understanding of all aspects of human psychology. Therefore, we can't touch on it. Maybe that's the question of where we need to rethink where we can have our understanding of liberty. I don't know. Oh, wait. I'm sorry.
Oh. Or give him his back.
Well, okay, this is just a possible suggestion. I'm wondering if it would work with the context for the quote Samantha was worried about. The mind is the subject of theology. So that seems, if you read it as subject matter of theology, then it sounds heretico, Schleiermacher or something. But if it's something like the mind is the experiencing subject or the thinking subject of theology, and the idea is more yeah, well, and that would fit into the vestibula idea. You know, first we've got to get clear on some things about the mind, given that it's going to be doing the theology, and then that'll make way. So, anyway, a suggestion.
You know, just as there is heresy within theology, I think there is no question that there is philosophical heresy. So I don't know if the freedom in the philosophical area is absolute. I think there are philosophies that are dangerous and false. Just as there is science fiction, I think there is philosophy fiction. And I think there are philosophies that fit best with Christianity, revelation, and then there are philosophies that militate against it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, Paul warns about us about that, and you know, already when he says that, you know, when he's talking about, what's that? Yeah, Colossians 2:8. Thank you. I just went out of my head. Colossians 2:8. He says, you know, beware of, you know, false philosophy there, which is often very badly, you know, misquoted in some circles to mean that all philosophy itself. I mean, any of us who have done philosophy, we've had to, and you're a Christian, you have to deal with that quote because you usually hear it at church. That, you know, philosophy itself is bad, but Paul never says that. He says there is philosophy that conforms to Christ. So he recognizes there is. And I mean, this is the whole point of what we're looking at natural law. That wait a minute, there is some knowledge that is available to every human being that conforms. There's the laws, the moral governing principles, but then there's the intellectual principles, I think, as well, the epistemic principles, if you will, if we could put it that way, that do conform, that humans regard as true, and maybe that is what is common sense, you know, part of general revelation. You know that they're basically saying that what you see is what you get. You know, that there is no numinal realm of great mystery, but that, you know, there is a comprehensiveness to the world. Yes, well, you will be getting the last question here.
All right, well, it'll be a good way to throw a wrench into the works.
Oh, excellent. Just let's leave everybody confounded.
Because I probably don't understand about 99% of what's been said here, and most of the terms either. But
don't worry, same with us.
Okay. And so this is a question of maybe trying to get some clarity. From my understanding, and I may even be wrong in my understanding, but Cornelius Van Til, his observations of Princetonian apologetics, he felt were somewhat muddied because of common sense realism. Yep. And so how do you think possibly his observations, whether one would agree with all of Van Til or not, how do you think that helps contribute to the discussion?
Well, yeah, this Van Til is part of that modern reaction to common sense. And like I mentioned that's the distinction that, like I said, my mentor Gijsbert van den Brink mentioned, was that the Van Til, you know, largely encompassing even, you know, the Kuiperian, there's that whole tradition, dominated in Europe, and certainly in the Reformed world in Europe, and that, yeah, he said that really kind of cut off what you sort of see happening with the common sense. I think for him,
so is that where you're saying?
We're about to go to lunch, and we've got to explain Van Til. But yeah, no, just in brief, yeah, Van Til definitely, yeah, totally reacts against them. I think ultimately we're starting to see, with the whole natural law tradition that we've been talking about since last night, it's been large. That has been dominant in the Reformed tradition, and that includes Princeton, which is using these philosophies. But since Van Til, there's been this effort to sort of downplay that natural theology, natural law tradition. And I think, yeah, and we're just sort of, that's our goal now, is rediscovering. I think people like Van Til has so shaped our understanding within a lot of reform circles for the 20th century and early 20th century that we're trying to get back beyond him. I don't want to get all the details now, but I mean, we can certainly, maybe we're about to go out to lunch, we can sort of hash this out over a little bit with lunchtime.
So are you saying that he contributes to the Neo-Kuyperian cordoning off?
Yeah, I mean, they're different, but they're, yeah.
reformed as opposed to natural law.
That's
Whereas I would think it would actually, my understanding of him, it would actually comport with natural law, but maybe that's just my interpretation. So anyway.
Let's talk at lunch. Yeah, thank you.
Great, guys. Let's give him a good, rowdy hand of applause. Okay, so food is coming out. I had said, I guess, in the setup for all this, I said, 12:30. And so they erred on the side of going later, so we're all starving. Before we go out there, I think they're still in the process of just finishing bringing it out. Just a couple of quick things. How long, really, do we want to eat? I mean, it's a kind of